Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the ultimate potential of XR and AI, experiential design framework, as well as immersive storytelling. So, um, so I've been doing the Voices of VR podcast since 2014, and since then I've actually attended around 75 events, about 6.5 years now, and I've recorded about 1,500 different interviews, and I've published about 2/3 of it so far. And actually, back in 2016, I attended 4 different AI gatherings and recorded about 122 different interviews, and only had a chance to post 5 of them so far. And there's a number of reasons. One is that I've just been trying to cover VR as closely as I can, and I worried that as I dove into AI, that it would sort of dilute my VR coverage. But two, AI is actually very abstract and kind of difficult to have a direct embodied experience of. And so I decided to take a step back and wait until like the intersection between VR and AI happened a lot more. And so as I go to a lot of these different film festivals at like Sundance, South by Southwest, Tribeca, ITFA Doc Lab, the Venice Virtual Reality, as well as some of these specific AI conferences, academic conferences. Today, I'm going to be going over like 40 different experiences and trying to kind of break it down a little bit in terms of what we can learn from what's emerging and what patterns we're starting to see. So I've got this experiential design framework that I've been applying to virtual reality, and I'll be sort of walking through it here to help break down the artificial intelligence and as well as XR. So there's the quality, the context, character, and story of an experience. And now these 4 things, you can basically have an infinite way of breaking up human experience. This is not like a complete. It's definitely just one way that you can take a look at it. But I just find that it's pretty helpful. So I'll be diving into each of these quickly in more depth here. But the quality is like the quality of presence, and there's different centers of gravity for the different communications medium. I'll be diving into a little bit more. There's different contexts and kind of industry verticals that I'll be diving into, as well as like if you can look at through the lens of character, and finally the lens of story and how the story is unfolding. So I'm actually going to start with story, then go through like 40 different AI experiences, looking at this intersection between AI and XR, talk a little bit about the character dimensions, and then kind of wrap up things by looking at the context where I'll be talking about a little bit of the ultimate potential of XR and AI. So in terms of storytelling, we have the typical Joseph Campbell's hero's journey where you have a hero protagonist who is going on some adventure, starting on something that's very mundane, crosses a threshold, goes on an adventure, and then eventually comes back after achieving whatever goal it is. But it's essentially this cycle where there's a beginning, middle, and end. And there's Dan's Harmon story circle, which similarly tries to describe the different stages. There's many different ways you can kind of break up, but in essence, it's the building and releasing of tension. That's as simplest as I can make it. Like every story is sort of facing some obstacle and then overcoming it in some way. So in terms of VR and as well as games, there's a spectrum between authored narrative and generative narrative. So I think it's helpful to maybe start here and then dive into how AI is playing out in these different narratives. So there's a spectrum of interactive storytelling that starts with interactive, like the fully traditional, and then starting as you move more and more to the right, you start to add more and more agency, more and more interactivity. So just to give a visual metaphor, we have the 3-act structure and everything we know. This is something that's completely authored. And then you start to have like little branches in the narrative where there's decisions that are made, but at the end, it still kind of comes back to a center of like the same ending. Then you have like the choose your own adventure, where you basically go out into many different exponential potentials of a story. And it takes a lot of effort of actually authoring and writing all of this. And eventually you get to the point where it becomes a little bit more of an open world sandbox. This is where the narrative tension kind of dies down, and it's more of a world that you're exploring rather than sort of a story that you're receiving. And this is an example of a Facade, where they actually have ways of trying to mash up and give a narrative arc, but from a repository of lots of different, dialogue pairs. And then eventually the totally generative is going to start to look a little bit more like a probability space that you're exploring around, and it becomes more about designing that object-oriented space or designing a character or a personality than it is trying to design the specific story. It's like an emergent story or an emergent character or emergent personality. Okay, so that's the sort of overview of the story. And I think as you get more and more to the generative narratives, that's where you're going to see a lot more of the artificial intelligent technologies come into play here. Okay, so that's the story. Let's move on to the quality of experiences. And so this is going to be the bulk of what I'm going to be going through here today. I just went through and kind of did an audit and came up with around 40 total experiences, both VR as well as some other games as well. But in essence, whenever you're in a virtual reality experience or any experience, really, you have this blend of active presence, mental and social presence, embodied presence, and emotional presence. So each of these are all happening all at the same time, and every experience that you have is some combination of these things. So let's break that down a little bit. We can start to look at existing communications mediums. And so we can see like video games is all about expressing your agency. We have the internet and books, as well as the phones. That's like the mental and social presence. That is the ways in which that you use abstractions of language to be able to make choices, take action. It's your belief system. It's your model of the world that you have in your mind that is either plausible or not plausible. And then we move to film, and that is the building and releasing of consonance and dissonance cycles. It's basically modulating your feelings through music and editing and rhythm, and it's giving you this experience of time. And then finally, we move into the embodied presence, which is architecture, theater, all these elements of the space, the world, your sensory experience, and you're putting your body into the experience for the first time with VR. Another way we can look at these four is to kind of break it into a dialectic between the yang and the yin, where the yang is putting your energy outward and the yin is receiving energy. It's either giving energy outward or receiving. You're either talking or you're listening. And a lot of these dialectics, they kind of are pairs with each other. Like you need to have them both. And again, just like yang and yin, it's not like an extreme polarity. It's a combination of the two. And so again, as we come back to this, you can see how VR is trying to blend all of these things together. So it's a little bit of gaming, a little bit of website design, a little bit of cinematic film. And, this is where it's particularly interesting for me, at least, to talk to architects, because I think architects have a lot of insight in terms of what's it mean to design spaces to be able to help modulate your sense of embodied presence. But all these other senses of presence are also there. And it's like, fusing together all these different design disciplines. All right, so let's dive into emotional presence. So if we look at Westworld, this is where you see like I'd say at least what we can see now is one ultimate potential, where you go into this world and you're able to just live into these stories, and you have these fully fleshed out characters that have deep personalities, and you're able to have whatever adventure that you want to have. So this is like trajectory that we're on when it comes to immersive theater, interactive narratives, but it's basically you're able to go into this and have whatever type of experience that you want. And then Facade, this is back in 2005, and this was you go into Grace and Tripp's home, and they're married, and you're essentially typing in text, natural language input, and you're interacting with each of them, and you actually have to like build rapport and relationships with each of them. And there's like 5 different endings, and over 2,000 dialogue pairs. And as you go through this experience and move around this space, then it is dynamically changing the narrative to have the most dramatic effect for whatever conditions you have. So you can kind of think of a counter that's being counted up. And then as you go through this experience, then it's serving you a dynamic narrative based upon whatever actions that you're taking. So this is actually a very sophisticated AI that, this came out in 2005, and it's amazing because there really hasn't been a lot of other experiences that have really matched the level of narrative sophistication that Facade has been able to achieve. There's this amazing experience called Bad News, and there's a lot that's going on here. So you walk up and you get this tablet, and you are and the conceit is that somebody's just died, and you have to find the next of kin and tell them. And you're able to navigate into these different places, and there's like a whole deep simulation of this world of people that are actually like simulated characters that are moving around this world. There's someone behind the scene who's like operating this simulation. The guy, there's one actor who is basically embodying every single character. And so you walk into a bar and you see two people and you start talking to one of them, and that person that's sitting across from you looks at all this information about what their personality is, what the character's knowledge is, and then basically you have like an improv scene. And you keep doing that over and over and over again with the same improv actor, and you're talking to all these different people. So you're essentially like getting this experience of being immersed within a world, but there's all this deep simulation going on the back end. Okay, so in 2016, there was a piece called Sunspring by Ross Goodwin and a number of other creators, where they feed in a lot of sci-fi prose, and then they have this AI that essentially spits out this script, and then it's kind of like incomprehensible, but yet they have these actors like Thomas Middleditch act it out. And it's like, what's amazing is that how much meaning is being able to be imbued by the actors that are doing the acting. But Ross Goodwin then at the IDFA Doc Lab premiered this Won the Road, which he put all this AI within a car, and the car was driving around taking sense information from the outside world. And this is basically a gonzo novel that was written by artificial neural network, and that he is curating the AI to be able to make all these observations of the outside world and essentially write this novel. Virtual reality is a narrative piece, and it has AI that's featured within the actual piece. And there's little subtle ways in which they start to use AI to do world building or character development. They're kind of sprinkling in AI within the development. It's kind of subtle and not really all that obvious, but the narrative itself is pretty amazing because you're in the future talking to these AI robots, and it's just a lot of fun. So there's this experience that it's called from the USC ICT. It's a multi-sense as well as some sensei. So the idea with emotional presence is these AI technologies are going to be able to look at your face and be able to detect what kind of emotions that you're having. Now, this actually makes a lot of sense if you're having like a therapeutic relationship where you want to be able to have an AI bot be able to detect what kind of emotions that are happening. And then given what emotions that are happening, then you have the ability to have different therapeutic effects from that. So you start to see the enterprise applications, medical applications before it gets into consumer technology. And then 10 AR was also from Turner Claus, where it was at Sundance, premiered at 2018. You look at your phone and you make these different emotional expressions, and the conceit is that there's these AI fish that are feeding off of your emotions. And so they found ways to be able to have you have this narrative experience by using the sentiment analysis technology within Google to be able to play with these different AI characters. But there's also ways in which it does object detection. And then as it detects different objects, then it's able to engage with those as well within a narrative. So that's a good example of a AR narrative that came out. There's an experience at Tribeca that I saw called Stealing Your Feelings. And you walk up and you basically, you're watching this video and you have facial detection that's watching you as you're watching this video. And it's making all these judgments as you're watching it. Like, a dog will come up and it's like, oh, you don't like dogs, or, you have an affinity towards women or men. And so it sort of makes all these conclusions and judgments as you're watching it, and some of them are quite provocative. So it creates this dissonance within you that it's you feel like there's a transgression that's being made. But we have AI that's making all these different judgments on us all the time. A Jester's Tale was a narrative experience at Sundance back in 2019, and this experience was kind of like playing out the Turing test. The idea was that you would have to, in the future, prove that you're human by watching a story play out. And at the end of this experience, it's a bit of a spoiler, but I don't know if it's ever going to play again, but you see the person who is volumetrically captured, this little boy is like trapped in the wall. They pull back the wall and there's this like kid in a cage, like that's in the wall. And you just have experienced this whole volumetric experience of you trying to prove that you're human. And then all of a sudden at the end, you're asked whether or not you want to sacrifice yourself or sacrifice this AI or this kid that's actually in the wall. And the point that Asad J. Malik was trying to make is that as we anthropomorphize AI, it's going to be able to emotionally manipulate us in ways that we are making decisions that go against our own best interest. So in this experience, I decided to sacrifice myself, but it's just because, there's an actual person there. But in the future, there's going to be AI and virtual beings. They're going to be using and hijacking different aspects of our social courtesies to be able to manipulate and control us in different ways. So that was this whole point, to be very provocative about that. And Artificial Room 1, this was an experience, again, looking at the Turing test. It was a theatrical performance where there was actually people on the back end who were monitoring everything that you were saying and doing, and you start to interact with it. But, we already go through, and, there's an adversarial relationship where you have to constantly prove that you're human, and you're declaring that I am not a robot, I'm not a robot. And so, this piece started as like, is AI going to eventually replace theater actors? And so they started to play with the Turing test and what does it mean to be intelligent, and how do you determine whether or not someone's human or not? And so they kind of go through a whole series of tests of like showing you a person, asking you if that's a real person or not. And, obviously they're using a lot of these, completely fake generated faces, and just trying to show the degree of which that AI has already progressed, and ways in which that humans have difficulties telling what the difference is between the virtual and the real. But this was a provocative theater piece that I think, starts to play with the conceit of the Turing test as a way to kind of explore what's it mean to be human. An Infant of the Moon Disaster premiered at IFA Doc Lab out at MIT. And they basically recreated Richard Nixon making a speech in the case of the Apollo 11 moon, that whole mission crash, if it would have crashed into the moon, they would have had this whole speech that then was written, and then they basically have Nixon give it. And they have this whole setup where you watch it on a retro TV, and they have this whole newspaper there, astronauts stranded on the moon. But pretty amazing to see like the degree to which that deep fakes can be able to potentially, trick us. And as we move forward, and we just, heard a whole presentation from that. From Nita. So that's an overview of emotional presence. So the mental and social presence, there's an experience called Prom Week from 2011, where the conceit is that you are at a high school and you need to like find a date for prom, and you have all these different social dynamics that are happening. It's essentially like a social networking simulator where you can have different relationships with all these different characters, and with each character you can do different things, and that as time progresses, then you're trying to kind of either sabotage other people or trying to seduce other people to become your date for the prom. And it's just kind of like a very short, quick, social experiment, but there's a lot of different relational dynamics that are set up on the back end. That is this whole kind of social networking simulator that as we move forward, we're going to have much more dimensions of this social dynamics. And so when you think about social mental presence, it's, getting the sense that you're a part of a community, a part of a culture. So there's this piece called Immerse that I had a chance to see at the Portland VR meetup, and back in like 2016, I think I saw it, but it first came out in 2015. The idea is that the military, this is a DARPA project where it was called The Good Stranger, where you go into Iraq and you need, or these foreign countries where you don't speak the language, and you need to be able to like communicate with the people to get information. And so you actually have to build rapport with these different virtual characters, and you're using your body language and different gestures to be able to do that. And the fascinating thing about this is that there was actually different personality modules that they had set up here. You kind of see a whole spectrum of like positive affinity and negative affinity. And so you could, turn off one of those different personalities and then it would change their behavior. But there were kind of modules that were on top of each other. So there's different, modules of personality that as they add together, you get different emergent behaviors. And it also had social dynamics where if you get someone who's a positive affinity and negative affinity, then a person who's negative affinity may, stop the other person because they want to be cautious. And so you have all these really interesting like social dynamics that they were able to simulate here. Teach Live is using virtual humans, and it's using a Wizard of Oz technique where there's one person who's called the interactor on the back end who's controlling 5 children. And you have a teacher who's interacting with these children. And the person who's the interactor is embodying different personality types. And they have the teacher who needs to be able to identify those personality types and be able to communicate with those kids in a very specific way. And then the Shoah Foundation did, virtual humans, where they did this whole archive project of, doing these volumetric capture of Holocaust survivors. And then you'd be able to ask questions to these Holocaust survivors, and based upon these, 20 to 40 hours worth of oral history interviews, it would then respond to you, whatever the answer was. And this has since been turned into Storyfile oral histories, where it's now a phone app, or you could be, watching on a screen. But the idea is that you would be able to record these massive amounts of oral histories and then be able to speak to it like you're just able to actually have a conversation. And you also have training for nurses, where nurses need to be able to stand up to surgeons if they're not following the protocol. But because there's a power differential, then sometimes it could be hard for nurses to be able to stand up and say, hey, you need to follow this protocol here. And so using, and getting enough people together to be able to do the training can be difficult. And so they actually find it's just as effective sometimes to use virtual humans here. So again, using these virtual humans to be able to do this type of soft skills training. So Provocative AI does these soft skills training. So, you're in VR and you need to be able to deal with all these different edge cases and be able to do this natural language speaking. And as you speak, then it's able to detect what you're hearing and then be able to guide you through all the different ways. So it's basically a good way to be able to train folks. This company actually wanted to start with narrative first, but narrative wasn't ready. And so they went into this enterprise training route. Fall in Love was from 2017. And it's, again, you ask a question and you get an answer. And this is just using a billboarded video. And so as you're talking to these bots, they're not able to really interact with you, but you're just asking a question, they're able to answer something that's being already pre-recorded. And then Kevin Cornish took that same idea and expanded it in 2019, the Second Civil War. It's a whole narrative that had a little bit more branching narrative, and using that same technology, and then using that same technology used from Avenues, which was able to train social workers as they're going in to see if they needed to take children away. So Child Protective Services are going in, you need to be able to assess the situation, ask different questions, and get enough information. And I'd say this is probably one of the most intense narrative experiences I've ever had at the end, because I had to decide whether or not I was going to take this child away from their parents. And this is an experience where you actually have to speak out loud, and you're saying these things of trying to tell the parent that you're going to be taking their children away. And it was really quite heartbreaking to do. And, again, it's very effective and helps to filter out people if they're not really cut out to be able to do this type of job. Starship Commander just came out in September, but originally the arcade version came out in 2018, where you are asking and doing interaction and being able to do this whole world building of this virtual world, where they have about 2 hours within this 15-minute arcade experience, where there's this whole backstory. We can ask about the ship size, what's the story with the Echnians, this alien race, and then you essentially are issuing commands to the spaceship to be able to fly around. Originally, they wanted to have a little bit more diplomacy aspects as they sort of use your spoken word to be able to describe different aspects of what ways in which that you wanted to explore, using your voice as a non-violent diplomacy gameplay mechanic, but they had to really scale it back. So Chomsky versus Chomsky was at Sundance 2020. And this is a very interesting experience because they basically took dozens and dozens of hours of Noam Chomsky and lots of his writings. And they basically created a Chomsky bot where you can go in and ask this Chomsky whatever you want. But the other interesting thing is that they actually did a lot of really interesting AI modulation of this world as you're going into it as well. So you're kind of walking into this really fragmented, modulated world and being able to ask Noam Chomsky any of these questions that you want based upon this whole archive that they created. And they also had specific questions, and they kind of shaped it a little bit as well. So it wasn't totally open-ended. It did have a little bit of a narrative arc and really strong points. And it ended up being a lot about a meta discussion about the nature of AI itself. When I was at SIGGRAPH in 2017, I was able to use Neural, where it's a brain control interface where you put it on your head and you're able to essentially train it to be able to do telepathic moving of objects by just using your brain. It's probably one of the more magical things I've experienced in VR, but it was using a lot of AI on the back end to be able to take your EEG data and be able to interpret it into actionable information within a virtual reality experience. And so you're going to be able to get to this point where you're able to have brain control interfaces that are able to essentially read your mind. So Frankenstein AI in 2018, a really interesting experiment, lots of different dimensions to this. I'll sort of talk through some of them and get into the last part here in the next section. But you were, this AI was asking different aspects of what's it mean to be human. And so you're asking it questions and it's asking you questions. And there's other ways in which that you have two people that are interacting at this whole table, and they're using the AI to be able to facilitate these interactions with another person. And then they had a whole AI and dance that I'll sort of talk a little bit more here in the next section. But then at the Doc Lab, they actually did a dinner version of Frankenstein AI where you're sitting at a table with other people, and on your plate is a earphone. You put it in your ear, and you have AI that's like feeding this, like that's listening to the group discussion. And then, you know, there's a human that I think is help listening and maybe help coding, because it's hard to get all of it, but is sort of tracking the sentiment of the conversation. The AI is feeding you questions to help guide and direct the course of a conversation that you're having with a group of people, which is really weird to have an AI moderator to a group conversation with a bunch of strangers. Emergence was a piece that was at Sundance 2019. And what's interesting about that is that, you know, you're walking around and you see these social dynamics as you're moving around. You get this sense of being in this world with these other people. And there's different sort of modes that they have, different behaviors of either flocking and being attracted or being repelled by you. But it was really quite interesting to see this immersed within VR. Wolves and the Wolves is an example of going into all these different dimensions of acting, embodiment, the virtual characters, using immersive theater actors to be able to really create this sense that you're interacting with this virtual being. Probably the best embodied virtual character that I've seen so far. Magic Leap's Micah in 2018. It's basically you're looking at Micah, you establish these different, you know, she's looking at you in the eye, and you get up and you basically put help her hang up a picture of this is not a pipe, essentially. And so it was sort of a meta experience. But you know, having these different types of virtual beings that are able to interact with you, and what kind of assistance are we going to have them do? So that's the mental and social presence. The active presence. Blurtasia is an amazing world to sort of explore around, and these little blurts had like early inklings of like our artificial intelligent behavior. And then Anandala, also by Kevin Mack, started to have these really emergent behaviors. Probably the most interesting AI that I've seen in a VR experience yet, because as I moved around, it was actually tracking my body movements. So you can imagine like super hot, or something that's tracking as you're moving around. So something that's able to dynamically respond to your movements is probably one of the subconscious levels of intelligence that we have. And so Kevin Mack's been doing some really interesting experiments here with these blorts. Half-Life Alyx, you know, anything that is a, you know, in games, you typically call anything that you have, like even if it's heuristic or any type of proper AI, they call it AI anyway in the industry. But I think the AI within Half-Life Alyx is probably some of the most evolved AI that I've seen so far in a VR experience. And in the future, it's going to be more and more like you're playing against other humans. There's still quite a big difference between playing against a computer and playing against another human. But I think eventually we'll get to the point where when you go into these worlds, it's going to like feel like your enemy is like another person, even though it's AI. Agents was a piece that just came out recently. This is from the National Film Board. And so this is an experience where you have these AI bots. Some of them have reinforcement learning and some are just heuristic, but it's a cinematic narrative, but an interactive experience where you're putting different actions that are happening, and then it's sort of going you through like three different phases. But it's a fairly quick experience, and you kind of iterate over and over again, and you try to figure out, you know, the heuristics and the behaviors of these little AI bots. But it's kind of an interesting experience. So that's the active presence, and I'm going to go into the embodied presence and then pause for a second because I'm not sure if I'll be able to get through the rest of all the other slides. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions as well. But the sense of embodied presence is the, so the embodiment of AI is robotics. And there's a huge overlap between using virtual worlds to be able to train these robots. So you have a robot learn this domino task within a virtual reality environment that NVIDIA created called Project Holodeck. And then you have this Isaac robot that's using the exact same neural networks to do the tasks and to be able to successfully perform those tasks in reality. So you have this conceit that VR is going to be able to be a little bit of like this sister technology to AI, where you're able to create these virtual environments to be able to train up, whether it's driving around a car or just having these robots do these different tasks, and in an environment that's safe to do that. And we have this long history of like virtual simulations and trainings, with the DeepMind's playing Atari with deep reinforcement learning back from 2013. But we have these virtual simulations that have actually, like these Atari games from the 80s that have been this playground for like the most cutting edge deep reinforcement learning algorithms. So in the future, I imagine that we're going to see like AI robots playing Job Simulator from 2016. This is my prediction, that eventually, like, just as we're like going back to like having AI play Atari games, we're going to have like AI robots playing the early versions of VR games. And it's going to be like training those AIs in a very specific way. Alteration is like the sense of embodied presence. So ways that you can like change the environment, like it's embodied and environmental presence. And so using like style filters to be able to like do this kind of deep dream type of modulation of the world around you, or style transfer. So using different filters to be able to change the aesthetic within a virtual reality experience, whether it's a CGI or a 360 video. The Frankenstein AI, they actually created a whole language where they were asking the audience questions, and they were taking the answers to those questions, doing sentiment analysis, doing a translation, and then feeding a signal into the back, like a haptic signal that was like a coded language to the dancer. And then the dancer was interpreting whatever the sentiment analysis that was coming from the AI. And they created a whole language to be able to do all that as well. And then Elsinore, this is an experience where they have a whole deep simulation that goes into Hamlet, and it's a timeless experience, and you're trying to change the dynamic, but each of your actions is actually playing into this deep simulation of this complicated way of like making sure that whatever action you take actually ripples out and changes so many other things that you couldn't even think of. So it's quite a sophisticated simulation of a world, probably the most sophisticated that I've seen so far, that has a deep simulation of the world that is trying to make sure that each of your actions have some consequence. And you just have to keep playing again and again until you get to the goal of the game. And then The Life of Flowers is the last one, where this is at Venice of 2019, where you're speaking into the experience, and as you speak into it, it's trying to do this sentiment analysis and then translate that sentiment analysis into specific flowers. So it's asking you kind of these open-ended questions, and then as you answer them, then you get this embodied representation of whatever your emotions are. So that's the qualities of presence: active presence, mental and social presence, embodied presence, and emotional presence. I'll go through the last part, and then I might have to skip the very last part just for sake of time. So that's a quality experience. The character of experience, we have the ways in which that, in some ways, as we go into these virtual reality experiences, we're going to be facing AI virtual beings that have a very specific character. And from a Jungian perspective, there's going to be parts of ourselves that we're projecting onto those characters. And so there's ways in which that the creators are projecting their consciousness into these virtual beings. And then as we go into these virtual beings, we're projecting our own consciousness into them as well. And so, in the Westworld, this is one way in which they start to come up with all the different dimensions of a personality. But this is the type of thing that you're going to start to see a lot more of, like, how do you create a personality? What is the character of this virtual character? And so you can start to look at things like temperament. What's the temperament of the character? What's the moral virtues? You can go through all the different virtues of that character. You can have the virtual continuum. And so having different dialectics between these different virtues. You can have needs and the feelings of those characters. So what do they need? What are they feeling? and then the big five personality characteristics. So essentially, there's lots of different ways to talk about character, but character in AI is going to get more and more important because it's going to be more about cultivating and developing those characters in ways that's generative, not just like writing one word, but sort of the underlying formula to be able to generate personality in any situation and context. The last aspect, and I'll probably not go through all of these slides, or maybe I'll just go through super quick, the domains of human experience. Whenever I ask people the ultimate potential of VR and AI, I found that in my 120 interviews that I did in AI, I sort of came up with a similar kind of like buckets of when I asked what the ultimate potential is, it's entertainment, medicine, career, education, friends and family, identity, all these things that you can kind of break up these different contexts. Ethics, when you look at the issue of ethics, you can look at these different things. You can look to my XR Ethics Manifesto, and the work that I've done in ethics uses this as a framework to sort of map out all the different disciplines. There's the concept of contextual integrity from Helen Nissenbaum. So mapping out human context is a huge open problem because it's sort of like, there's so many infinite numbers of contexts. So it's the girdles and completeness of either you're consistent or you're complete, but you can't really be both. So you have to choose. So I decided to sort of like try to be complete, but there's going to be inconsistencies. Or if there's or it's difficult to be completely complete. So anyway, there's a trade-off there between completeness and inconsistency. But I went through and mapped out all the different. Just did a lecture on all the different higher education in the United States, the top 40 for different academic disciplines, and which ones were early adopters of XR, early majority, late majority, and then started to map that out into this context. You could see that entertainment is really big, medicine's really big, architecture is early adopter, the early education, as well as some of the higher education stuff, but some of the other contexts aren't as fully developed. And that's probably a good place to stop because I could probably talk for another 10 or 15 minutes about all these other things that I've gone through. But I'll just zip through at the very end. That's probably another half-hour talk there, if I'm honest. So I'm going to stop there and just sort of recap the 4 dimensions of experience: the story, quality, character, and context. I always prepare more than I have time for, and in this case, well, I had 170 slides for a half-hour talk, so I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kent. That's great. I always appreciate your diagram. You're very thoroughly structured lecture. That's great. So I'll open up for questions from everybody. So please don't be shy and don't hesitate to ask anything that ponders over your mind.
If you use the raise hand function that's in the participants box, we can unmute you, or you can type your question in the chat and we can ask it on your behalf, or we can unmute you to ask your question. There is actually one question that's already in the chat, which is kind of asking about whether having AI detect AI-created synthetic media solve the problem. And like in the GAN generator, like the way that tries to generate realistic images, and a discriminator tries to discriminate realistic versus fake AI-generated content.
It sounded like a question for Nina, but I do have a thought, which is that, there will be like a cat and mouse game here with this stuff where you have AIs generating content, and then the AIs that are the adversarial AIs trying to detect if anything has changed. I know that Adobe's even started some certification dimensions there because they just released a version of Photoshop that allows you to do all sorts of different AI manipulations. And so, as we move forward, is there going to be some level of audit trail for any sort of digital alteration that you've done? And, like the AIs that are detecting anything that you've done, it's like an infinite recursive loop where that's never going to end. It's just going to go back and forth. I think of it, the metaphor of the cat and mouse game. But we have more questions.
Rami, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, guys, for these excellent presentations. And actually, the question is more directed at Nina, but I'm happy to hear either of your thoughts. So basically, I'm coming from a philosophy background, and we have this thought experiment in epistemology that focuses under the conditions under which a subject can know. And so the scenario begins with a subject who sees a barn, and on the basis of having seen a barn, sorry, I thought I was I had it muted. Having seen the barn, they can know that there's a barn there. But then the subject is transferred into this other condition, which is barn facade county. And in barn facade county, although there are some real barns, there's also a lot of barn facades. And now the situation becomes such that when the subject sees a barn in barn facade county, even though her experience is identical to the experience that she has before, it no longer counts as knowledge, because now the situation is degraded so that seeing a barn or seeing a barn facade can't be told apart from one another. So I wonder if, in a situation where deep fakes become prevalent, whether images and videos would stop counting as evidence of any sort. It's not just that you would be able to deny everything, but also you would have no good reason to believe that a picture is authentic or a video is authentic. So I just want to hear your thoughts. Of course, there's the transition period you spoke about, but I'm just interested in your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think Nina actually had to drop off. But I do have some thoughts just from sort of thinking about these issues as well. Agnes Callard has this take on Socrates where she said the Socratic method sets up this dialectic, and the dialectic is trying to solve this problem from William James and Clifford, which is that the way that Callard phrases it is that it's impossible to believe all truths and reject all falsehoods, and to do those two algorithms at the same time because they're actually mutually exclusive. So what that means is that if you think about prosecuting something in justice, you have the prosecution, you have the defense, and they're two separate teams, and they're responsible for operating within these rules, and then they present their case, and then they have a jury deliberate. Well, that's similar to like the peer review method within science, which is that you put forth an idea, but even if you proved and have the hypothesis, you want to wait until other people have replicated it because you don't know if you've missed something. And so you have that inherent deliberative dialectical process that's happening within a larger community process. So I've been thinking about the simplest that I can like reduce this down, this epistemological question is, how do you, as an individual, believe all truths and reject all falsehoods when, there may not be a way. I think as an individual, you need to be able to be comfortable with paradox, first of all, which is that you may have to like simultaneously believe and disbelieve it, and not sort of like to have more of a Bayesian probability mindset and metaphor around it, which is what AI actually does. When AI makes judgments, it doesn't say like, this is 100% sure. They say, no, we think it's about 73% sure that this is true. So when you think about the philosophy of science, it actually like doesn't use like Bayesian probability. And there's been some philosophers that have actually been trying to like shift to more Bayesian approaches, but it's not necessarily like Bayesian isn't the total answer, because sometimes there's just a truth and it is binary. And so how do you negotiate that in a world where anybody could make up anything else, and you have to judge what is real and what isn't real? And another dimension to that, which isn't so much around the deepfakes and the external stuff, but from the perspective of VR, which is your own direct experience. As a VR journalist, I am skeptical of my own perspective of things because I don't know if it's just me, if my technology is broken, so I'm resistant to just make a firm statement saying this sucks, because I would rather talk to other people. Well, first of all, talk to the creator to say, why did you do this? What was your intention? And to really listen to what their intention was, and to then match that with my own direct experience, and to see if there's a disconnect or not. If there is a disconnect, one of two things are happening. One, it's just, I missed it, and it's up on me of like, I missed it in my perceptual input. Or two, it's a failure of communication of the artist who isn't using the medium to be able to accurately communicate the intention that they're trying to do within that medium. So I think there's the element, which is the broader truth of what is the, the capital T truth of the external world. But I think there's some other interesting aspects of, like from more of a direct experience phenomenologically, because VR allows us to have like theoretically the same experience, assuming they have the same hardware and everything else. But once people can have the same experience, then you're able to start to focus in on this like many lenses into that experience and seeing different interpretations that may come up. And there's already been experiences like Gnomes and Goblins where, as a white cisgendered male, there's things that I didn't see that my wife saw, who noticed that there was no women that were goblins in this experience. And so she was able to see things that I didn't able to see. So I think a meta solution to all of these issues is to be as diverse and as inclusive as you possibly can, to get as many different perspectives and to sort of be comfortable with sitting in that paradox and allowing that dialectical process of believing truths and rejecting falsehoods to kind of play itself out, and to slow down the spread of viral memes on Twitter, which is Twitter's already starting to do, but to, kind of do that deliberative process, which is like, if something's going viral, then the journalists used to be the ones who were doing that check and balance and to get both sides of the story. But now we've moved into like what John Robb calls this network tribalism, which is that these social influencers, they get enough power to be able to just amplify stuff without having the other side. And I think that is like a dynamic of this network that, is a side effect, which is that you have people who are polarized onto one perspective, who have a very strong political perspective of what that is. And so we're not getting that natural dialectical process. Ideally, we would have both sides collaborating towards the truth, because you need to be collaborating towards that truth. But if you're only on one side and you're ignoring the one completely and there's no middle ground, that's where we start to have this phase alignment that gets really problematic.
Thank you.
Frederick?
Yeah, hi, Kent. Good to see you. Good to see you back at the AA again.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Also, just thanks, Eduardo and Oliver, for setting this up. It's really exciting. Kent, I was curious to hear, because obviously you've been super busy in 2020, as you have been all other years, but in a very, very different way. It'd be just really interesting to hear if you could kind of summarize what are the key things that have been different, apart from just the fact that you obviously haven't been going to the events physically as you have before, but I mean, you have been just everywhere this past couple of months and interacted with possibly even more people than before. And with these immersive theaters and everything. And then just a follow-up question also would be interesting to hear, like, based on what Nina was talking about, and obviously you have a great insight in this as well in VR, like what would be our kind of mechanism to, if we would see something, we start to see trends of AI kind of meddling in our experiences in immersive media in a way that we think is kind of potentially dangerous or it should be talked about, then what is our mechanism? Like, is Twitter the only tool we have to kind of like, you've been using Twitter obviously incredibly productively to flag some serious issues in this industry in the last couple of months. So two questions in one.
Yeah. The first question. So I used to have a rule that I would only do an interview if I ran into somebody face-to-face at a conference and it was like unscheduled and unplanned and serendipitous. Because like I already have only published 2/3 of all the interviews I have, so I don't need to be doing any more virtual interviews. And so a big challenge for me is like trying to qualify what does a serendipitous collision look like virtually in a way that is sort of paying attention to what is emerging in the moment. When I travel to a conference, it's very easy because I'm just completely dedicated to listening to what's emerging in the moment. But here, it's like I can do 20 interviews in a week, which I did, and I still haven't published them all. So it's like this perpetual problem of trying to be what the line for me personally for what I'm doing between journalism and oral history. And depending on when it it's real-time oral history because I'm recording it in the moment, but sometimes it becomes more history than journalism, depending on when it finally gets published. So that's a challenge for what I'm personally doing, and maybe unique, trying to cover all the different dimensions of virtual conferences and all these other issues with what's happening with Facebook and everything else. So it's actually opened up new opportunities for me to talk to people that I may have not been able to talk to, which is good. So the other meta question, which is like, what do we do? How do we, I think there's a sense, there's an aspect of sense making, just general sense making. Like there's a lot of chaos in the world. How do you make sense of it? And so that's one of the things that I try to do on the work that I am doing within VR and AI is have some framework to make sense of it and some way to bound it. I mean, if I were to try to give you a talk about every application of AI, then, it's like, where do you even begin? So I take the approach of like, when I did all those AI conferences, it was like, okay, I did all these interviews, but like, somebody gives you an experience and it has a bunch of AI on it. How do you even evaluate if it's good or not? Like, how do you know what the data set is? How do you know like all the different, like you really need a big, like thousands of people to try it out. You can't just as an individual know that. The only thing I can know is whether or not I like the story or not. And so by focusing on the intersection between AI and immersive storytelling, it actually helps to bound this issue that is pretty unboundless. And I didn't have a chance to say this, but I think it's an important point. Andrew Stern, who was one of the co-creators of Facade, I did an interview with him and he said, AI, we're going to eventually get to artificial and general intelligence, maybe. I mean, it's an open question as to whether or not we'll get there. But, AI just absent of any context versus AI within the context of a story world, that AI that's within a context of a story world is able to trick you into being a lot smarter than it actually is. Because there's a lot of affordances of being within a story where it allows you to be a lot more forgiving and sort of take something that is completely unbounded and put it into a specific type of a context. So that's why I think, looking at AI in particular through the lens of how does AI coming together with VR, that's one way to look at it. I mean, the other dimension is that there's a lag between what's on the bleeding edge of AI, which you would get at a conference like NIPS, versus like what's the next phase of artists implementing it, which is like the AI IDE, versus how O'Reilly Enterprise is doing it, and then eventually 2 or 3 years later you get it into VR experience. Starship Commander started working on integrating with Microsoft Cognitive Services back in 2016, and it just finally launched in 2020. And there's literally nothing else that's out there. There might be some other ones that are out there that I just haven't seen that do that. But to do natural language input into a VR experience, the technology's been there for 5, 6, 7, how many ever years that those services first launched. But it takes time to propagate out and to be integrated by the artists. And I think that's part of the role of artists, is to see what is there and what the affordances are, and then to try to like integrate it into the experiences that you want. Which is why I like, trying to interpret these technologies through the lens of the human experience of these different qualities of presence. But just generally in terms of sense making, it's like finding people to follow and listen to. The web is turning more from public into private. So people are creating their Patreons, podcasts, sort of the dark force theory of the internet, as Yancey Strickler calls it, which is that we're moving away from, we're moving away from the public internet and into like these private Discord servers, these Zoom calls, podcasts, face-to-face synchronous conversations in virtual worlds. So that's just kind of the nature of where we're moving. And so for me personally, I take a recommendation from a person in real time as like having a lot more weight than hearing it from any other context. Because I know that if I'm in deep relationship to the people around me, then that is a way for me to have things emerge up. So I think that's risky for falling into the whole filter bubble dynamic and polarization and, only being around people. So, the loss of public space, I think, is a big concern in terms of how do you still find ways to get information that you wouldn't normally get. So that's where, again, comes back to like diversity and inclusion, which is try to be as diverse and inclusive as you can, personally as just your information diet and where you get information from.
Thanks, Kate. Kent, yeah, I'd just like to remind everybody to raise your hand or drop the question in the chat box. Maybe in the meantime, just a quick wonder I was having, Kent. In your presence diagram, you kind of run mental and social together, and I was wondering if you can expand a bit more on how do you see the association between the two, or how you consider the mental and social as being kind of the same part of a presence.
Yeah, and this also gets into the Gödel question, which is the inconsistent complete, where may not make complete sense. But if I were to try to explain it, these are based on like the Aristotelian elements, and so the air element is all about abstractions. It's about words. It's about language. And so when you think in your mind, it is sometimes you see in images, but a lot of times it's translated into like words. It's like as you have a thought, it gets translated into language. And language is our primary mode of communication that we use to communicate with other people. So we have this sense of connecting to people through that language. And so we have this sense of social presence, but there's also this dimension of even if there's no one else there, you can read a book. And as you read a book, you're able to really get inside of the mind of another person. So that's one way to sort of get into what other people are thinking. But it's also ways in which that you have your own plausibility. Like, does it make sense? Do you believe it? So there's a sense of like a suspension of disbelief. And so the belief part is the mental models that you have of reality and whether or not your direct experiences are matching that. And that's sort of, all those mental models are also embodied. So they're happening throughout the entire body. So when I'm pointing up to my brain, it's actually something that's like fully embodied. And that's the other thing, is that like each of these elements are actually all happening all at once, all at the same time. It's just a matter of degree. And so, when you really look at something like embodied cognition, well, it turns out like our motor cortex, which is the part of our brain that determines how we move, that's actually like a big way in which that we actually think. So these words are just ways to see how there's different trade-offs between them, like the making choices and taking action. That would be like more of the yang expression. And that's more energy going outward. So both of, like making judgments in your thoughts as well as connecting to other people, that tends to have a little bit more of the outward energy, even though, and then when you're listening and you're not talking, that's when you're just more in your body and you're sort of receiving that. Again, any of these like distinctions that I'm drawing is just semantic in language. And you could, like the Chinese, they use 5 elements as an example, so you could have different ways. You could do 3, you could do 2, like just yang and yin. So any of these, I think the point is that it gets back to the dialectic of the trade-offs between them. When I did the generative versus the authorial, that's really kind of like the agency versus narrative, and having control over like a fixed narrative versus, expressing your will into the experience. There's a dialectical relationship between to what degree are you expressing your will in an experience versus how much you can just really receive, listen, and empathize. Ideally, we'd be able to do them equally at the same time, but there's like this weird mutually exclusive dynamic that happens with dialectical relationships where it's never fully on one extreme or other. It's always, they're all happening at the same time. And it's like, you have to resolve what Jung called the tension of the opposites, which is that you hold both of them in steady until you have this reconciling third that comes up. It's like the thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis from a Hegel's perspective. So I think that process happens in direct experience. And part of my experiential design framework is very much based upon these dialectics, because there's decisions that you have to make as a creator as to whether or not you're going to put a bunch of text as an example and make people read, which is going to put them into mental space, versus can you explain it without using words? Can you explain it using architecture? Can you use it some sort of audio cue, or use music as a cue? So there's different decisions that will actually put your audience into a certain mode of being if you start saying, as an example, throwing a bunch of words at them. you have a decision as you're telling a narrative. Are you going to have a voiceover that's instructing people, or are you going to show them, which is a different modality? So that's sort of a little bit more. I mean, you can kind of look into the elements and the different interpretations of the elements to get a little bit more, but it's essentially the air element.
Gotcha. Thanks. Yeah, that's good. I think that's that might be it. I see everybody else is kind of silent. So if nobody else has any other questions, we might wrap it up, but no pressure. Thank you very much, Kent, anyway, to picking up the entire Q&A session. And yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. And looking forward to see you next Monday, right? I don't know where those coming from. I was like, who's actually, is it? Yeah, sorry, might have been an overlap there. I thought somebody from the audience actually was going ahead and asking a question.
It's not next Monday, but it's the Monday afterwards.
Yeah, sorry, I was planning to say that. Yeah, it's on the 9th. Yeah, the 9th, not the following Monday, but the Monday afterwards. We'll have the next session, which Anna and Sebastian from Cream will show us something, and maybe a surprise appearance, which we never know about, from Ross Goodwin, which I never know if I spoke with his bot or actually with him himself. It was funny to see you, Kent, mentioning his work earlier. We almost had him in one of the sessions, but it's still not fully confirmed.
Oh, who is that? I'm sorry, I missed
Ross Godwin.
Oh yeah, Ross.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of cool stuff that he's worked on. So yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're hoping to see more of. But let's see. Okay, so that's it then. Eduardo, Manijay, if there's nothing else to add, we can call it a wrap then.
Oh, that's fine.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you everyone for coming.